carrying on? How are you keeping?
Carrying on.
Carrying on.
Carrying on.
It's getting, they say, closer to Shul's opening.
Yes.
And they also, I mean, next Shabbos is already Shabbos Mevarchim Elul.
Yeah. Well, they're talking about Rosh Chodesh Elul opening.
Well, that's when the shuls will be able to. It doesn't necessarily mean
No. There's no obligations, obviously.
that's when the people will be ready to come.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's be anyway.
Not ready. Not ready.
Not really.
Well,
Nor am I.
Tracht gut wird sein gut.
Maybe Rosh Chodesh Nissan.
Be it as it may, is it almost 1 o'clock?
It is.
Exactly one.
Is
Ah.
one.
Ivan, we are yet.
Okay. It's what. In fact, it's one.
Okay, so we could start the 4th portion of the Torah, Devarim, which is Parshas Re'eh. This Parsha has many, many different relevant concepts to all of us. And this shir that we give weekly when we can is an overview with stressing certain other aspects, mainly from Rashi. But it is, as I say, mainly an overview of the Parsha and to point out certain things. So the word Re'eh means to see. And there's a very big difference. The Kabbalists and the Hasidus teaches us between what Moshe Rabbeinu asked and what he was granted. He asked Re'eh that we should see, and we were granted more along the lines of Shema Yisrael here. The commentaries tell us, one cannot compare seeing and hearing. The Jewish people that lived in the desert were on a level of Re'eh. They saw godliness. There was no disputing it. They saw all the miracles that they lived by, the manna, the water, the clouds that carried them, the protection. It was all on an aspect of seeing. Whereas later, it is not something we could put our finger on. It is rather Shema Yisrael, hearing. If one sees something with his own eyes, then it is not disputable. Everyone could come and say it's not that way, but you saw it. So you accept that that's what you saw. But it doesn't necessarily have the same depths as Shema, as listening and taking it apart in your own head. You know that to put it in mundane terms, there's a certain advantage that radio has over television, because radio, you have to, or even reading it in a book, you have to use your imagination much more, and you get a much greater grasp of everything than just the vision that you see, and then it can't be argued. So that is one of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu was asking for, was Re'iyah, that the Jewish people should continuously be on a level of being able to see godliness. As we know, today there are people who argue, who dispute whether spirituality and godliness even exists. But the portion starts with Re'eh anochi noisen lifnechem hayom bracho klala. Please note before you that I place before you today the blessing and the curse. And it goes on to tell you what the blessing and the curse is. The Rambam in Hilchis Teshuvah talks about the fact that each and every person has freedom of choice. You know, not everybody wants to take responsibility for their lives and for their actions. And we have many, many excuses that we use. Our upbringing, the challenges we face, and there are many overseas in America that are blaming all kinds of systemic racism on the opportunities that they have in lives. Even multi-billionaires are telling you all kinds of excuses. But the Rambam says we all have freedom of choice, whether to do the right thing, whether to do the wrong thing, whether to be righteous or to be wicked. We cannot go and apportion blame and take our responsibility out of it. And there are some who try and use a religious argument. They say, does God run the whole world? Is everything that happens only because of God's will? If that's the case, the fact that I did something wrong, blame God. He's the one who runs the world. So the Rambam says it's not so. God does run the world. And part of the way he runs the world is that he gives us freedom of choice. And we are accountable for our actions. And that's how the Parsha starts, by saying that we are liable and accountable, and that there is a cause and effect. Obeying the mitzvahs leads to blessings, and the opposite is true as well. And now Moshe Rabbeinu goes in to tell us about Eretz Yisrael, the land that we are going into, and the laws that we will have. Amongst the laws is a very interesting one. You know, in the days of the desert, all the Jews lived around the tabernacle. So it was very close. And in those days, if a person wanted to eat meat, it was mainly by bringing a sacrifice and getting the portions of the animal that were given to the person to eat. Otherwise, you couldn't eat meat. But when the Torah says when you go to Israel, that is going to be changed, because Israel is a vast place. With a place where you could bring a sacrifice will only be at a place that God chooses, depending on when it was in Jewish history. There were a few different places. There was Nevo, Givon, Shiloh, and finally Jerusalem. And if a person lived in Tzvas, and every time he wanted a bride, he'd have to take the animal to Jerusalem to make a sacrifice, that wasn't practical. So the Torah here permits us to sacrifice, to slaughter animals, to shecht animals, and to eat the meat. But however, he tells us that when it comes to sacrifices, there will be a situation once the Beis HaMikdash will be built, that you can't bring a sacrifice on what is called a bama, a private altar. There were certain times in history that you could, but then you will only be able to bring it then. And there were certain parts of the animal that even when you shecht it for your own personal use, there are certain parts that a Jew may not eat because they were given over to the altar. Amongst them is mainly in the hind quarter. And that is, do you know that there's two types of fat in the animal? One is called chalev, the other is called shumon. Chalev is a forbidden fat. That always went on the altar. And when you don't have an altar, when you can't bring the sacrifice, that part of the fat was never able to be eaten by a Jew. And the second is called shumon. Shumon is a type of fat like in the brisket. It's more intertangled into the meat. That meat, that fat we're allowed to eat. It's not so healthy. It is delicious. If you're making a burger, you want a certain percentage of that fat together in your burger. But that you're allowed, chalev you're not allowed. As I say, chalev is just layers of fat without the meat intertangled, and that's mainly in the hindquarters. Similarly, there's the sciatic nerve, which isn't mentioned here, that we're not allowed to eat. And so, because of that, in most countries, Jews don't eat the hindquarter at all. And the Torah also tells us that we have to be very, very careful when we slaughter meat not to eat the blood. The blood, the Torah says, is the home, is the garment that the soul runs through, and therefore we're not allowed to eat it. It's quite ironic, and that's the way it seems to be in life, that the Jews, who are the most scrupulous in the whole world, of all the nations of the world, not to touch, not to eat blood, we are the ones who are accused of blood libels, Rachmana litzlan, of eating Christian blood noch. But the Torah goes on to tell us, and that is one of the reasons we sold our meat. I never forgot the first time I bought a microwave oven in this country. It came from America. And when you buy something for the first time ever, you read the manuals and the booklets. And reading that booklet, it said, kosher meat is not ideal for the microwave. And the reason is because it has so much salt. Before you get to it, the salt in the microwave destroys the meat. So even that booklet there said how much salt the kosher meat has. And I guess that's one of the differences between those treifa cuts that you get and why they could be so tender, because they haven't been had that salt in it before. But the Torah continues to warn us that the meat may not be eaten. And then the Torah also tells us a very, very important law. And that is the laws of what we have to give to the Kohen, and in that time, the Levi. There was a certain truma offering that we gave from all our products. The Jews were mainly farmers, so all their products that they grew, they had to take off a truma, and then they have to take off a meiser, a tithe. And they divided it into 6 years. I'm sorry, actually it was 7 years, but the actual growing the crops was divided into 6 years, because the 7th year they didn't grow the crops at all. So you had 6 years that you worked your field. So you have year 1, 2, and 3 that had laws, and then 4, 5, 6 that had laws. Year 1 and 2, year 4 and 5. Those 4 years out of the 6, after giving the truma, the first offering, and the meiser, the tithe, to the Kohen and the Levi, you had a law called meiser sheni. That is the second tithe. And the second tithe, the law was that you would take that to Jerusalem on the festival times, and it was given to you to eat, but you couldn't invest it in the JSE, in the Jerusalem Stock Exchange. You couldn't make investments with it. It was yours to spend. And the Torah tells us that by doing that, you will totally rejoice with those mitzvahs. And then the Torah goes on to warn us about the country of Israel we're coming into. You know, while the Jews lived in the desert, they were isolated. It was a total island. They didn't come into contact with anyone else. But once you're going into Israel, it is a land in which other nations will live. So then we will have contact with the nations around us. And the Torah prohibits us from learning certain aspects from them. We have monotheism. The nations at that time were very into idol worship and everything that went with it. And the Torah says you have to be careful not to learn from them, to admire those actions, and try, God forbid, to emulate them, and as a result, giving up what we have, our Judaism. And so the Torah says that amongst the things the idol worshippers used to do was child sacrifices. Believe it or not, this was what they used to do for many reasons. I remember my brother made a wedding in Peru, in Lima, and it was in those days that you could travel around the world, pre-COVID days. And I was there with my brothers. We went to a famous place called Machu Picchu, up in the mountains. And they have sanctuaries that idol worshippers made. And we were told by our guides that if you look down, they found bones of children. They used to make human sacrifices. And the Torah is totally against that. And he warns us that this is what can lead to that if you follow in the ways of the nations around you. And he says, the Torah I give you is perfect. Lo soise v'lo sigra. Do not add to it and not subtract to it. And then I'd like you to look, if you have a Chumash, to chapter 13, verse 2. The Torah here tells us how to be able to know the truth from the falsehood. You know, there is a concept of a prophet. A prophet is a person, not who so much foretells the future, but rather conveys the message of God to us. Now, if somebody comes, he tells us he's a spiritual person, and he is able to give us blessings, he's able to give us messages, there has to be a way to know who is truth and who is telling a lie. People are sometimes very naive, and we are culpable to just follow charismatic leaders without knowing whether they contain the message of God or not. And this is what the Torah tells you is the acid test. And I'd like to read it to you in a way, because one of the big religions in the world had complaints to the Jewish people that we didn't follow their Yoshke, their Yozel, whom they referred to as the Son of God, even though they say he came with so many prophecies, so many proofs, and so many messages. And throughout the years, the Jews are stubborn. They claimed to keep to Torah and mitzvahs. How do we know who is the real thing and who isn't? So if you want, you could look at Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 2, and I'll read it for you. If there stands up in your midst a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he will produce to you signs or wonders. He's going to do miracles. Like he'll walk on water. He will change water into wine. He will feed the hungry. He'll do all kinds of things. And then the Torah in verse 3 says, that those miracles or wonders that he promises you will come to fruition. And you want to know, do I listen to him or not? What is the acid test whether a person is a true prophet or not? So he says in verse 3, if he tells you to disobey the Torah in any type of way, if he tells you that the mitzvahs that God gave you is not applicable to today, it doesn't have to be kept anymore, then you should know, don't hearken to the words of that prophet or the dreamer of dream. And if you ask, if so, why did God allow those miracles and wonders that he said to take place? So the answer is in the Torah, because God is testing you, whether you should love Hashem or not. Just follow his mitzvahs. And that prophet and that dreamer of dream should be put to death, because he has spoken perversion against Hashem your God. And that the Yashke that people talk about, they claim, he said, for example, it's not important to be circumcised of the flesh anymore, but circumcised of the heart. They claim he said, it's not important what goes into your mouth, but what comes out of your mouth. What does the Torah say in this portion, as we'll see? That what goes into your mouth is very important. It gives us the laws of kosher are repeated in this portion. So you see that in fact, God says what goes into your mouth is important. God says you have to have a bris of your flesh. So if someone comes along and he says that is not important, irrelevant anymore, know that whatever else he tells you, God did not send him, which is one of the reasons why Jews stick courageously and continuously to Torah and mitzvahs and don't follow the other religions. And the Torah goes on to tell us that there can be a situation where it's your own brother, people who are closest to you, who try and take you away from Torah and try and incite you against to follow other ways and to follow other gods. Don't listen to them. And it can even happen that a whole city called an Ir Hanidachas loses its way and follows other means of worship and idols, and that city would be destroyed completely. And then in chapter 14, he says, Bonim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. We are all children of God. There's not a son of God. Every single one of us is considered a child of Hashem. And as a result, we have to be holy. And amongst the things it says here is, because we have that, we're not allowed to pull the hair out of our heads for dead, and we can't slash our skin. We have the law of kriya, of tearing our garments. But there were certain nations in those days that over the dead, they used to slash themselves. And that is, the Torah forbids it. And then the Torah goes into the laws of kosher. As I mentioned, here the Torah tells us the laws of animals, which is that any animal that has split hoofs and chew its cud will be a kosher species. Any animal that doesn't will not be a kosher species. But the Torah goes on to tell us that there is one animal in the whole universe that has split hoofs and doesn't chew its cud, and that is the pig. There are three animals that chew their cuds and don't have their split hoofs, that is the camel, and the arneves, and the shofar. There are different translations for that, but there are only 3 species that have the one sign of chewing their cud without split hoofs, and only one that has split hoof and doesn't chew its cud. That is the pig. The Torah was given to us in the year 2448. We are now in the year 5780. So you're talking about over 3,300 years ago. Since that time, there have been many continents discovered and thousands of species of animals discovered. And with all that, they have never, ever found a second species of animal that has split hoofs and doesn't chew its cud. I was once told that Charles Darwin traveled the world. He was looking for a few things. He was looking for the missing link, and he was also looking for a second species of animal that it would have split hoofs and doesn't chew its cud, so he could prove the Torah wrong. As you know, he went to Australia. He may have seen the kangaroo, he may have seen the panda bear, he may have seen the chveisvos, all the different animals, but he will never find another animal besides the ones the Torah says that has one species. And the reason is very simple. The same one who created the world wrote the Torah, so he knows exactly what he created. I'd like to point out that here we're only discussing the species. We're not discussing the way that they slaughter the animal or prepare it. That was touched on in the blood. So the fact that a person only eats beef might be good enough for other people, for other religions, but it's not good enough for the Jew. Making sure that you only eat beef burgers or chveis or chicken, even on a plane or a restaurant, if it hasn't been shechted properly, if it hasn't been salted, and all the means of preparation haven't been done, then it is not kosher. The Torah also goes on to tell us what lives in the water. What lives in the water has to have fins and scales. Anything from the water that doesn't have fins and scales and is alive may not be eaten. That includes all the prawns, the lobsters, the chazarai that people eat. And the Torah also tells us about in the fowl, the bird world. It gives us a few names of non-kosher birds, and the Talmud goes into how to distinguish between a kosher bird and a non-kosher bird. Interesting to note, there were 5 signs of a kosher bird, but we follow tradition, and therefore you may have certain birds, for example, that Sephardim eat that Ashkenazim don't, because it's not in our tradition. The other thing is just an interesting factor, that when they came to America, there was a big bird there called the turkey. And they didn't see the turkey in Europe and Israel and where they came from. So there was a whole debate amongst the rabbis then whether to permit it or not. As we all know, thank God they did. And so a Jew on Thanksgiving can have his turkey dinner. Though it is hard to cook, but it is kosher. And as I mentioned here, it talks about the second tithe. And it talks also about looking after the poor. There's a very big mitzvah after discussing the laws of Shemitah in helping the poor. And it tells us to give tzedakah. And the verses are in chapter 15, verse 7 and onwards, that if you find amongst you a destitute person, then don't harden your heart or close your hand to him. Hashem demands and wants us to open up our hearts to him and to make loans to him, and to make sure that we help them, because the Torah says you should know destitute people will not cease to exist within the land. And therefore, I command you to do this. I would like to compliment South Africa, especially for having the organizations that we do. For example, the Chevra Kadisha has an emergency fund now that it's trying to help people, because sadly, with the COVID and all that we're going through, we are finding more and more destitute people and people who are struggling, losing their jobs, being forced to take reductions in salaries and not being able to keep up with the bare minimum. Thank God the host of our shir, Mandy Yachad, is very involved with the Rambam Foundation, which helps people with what is probably what the Torah says and what the rabbis write in a way is even greater than charity and than tzedakah, and that is making interest-free loans to people, because the Torah doesn't only want us to help them, it also wants us to preserve their dignity. And this is amongst the things of tzedakah. Now, what are some of the differences between tzedakah that the Torah here commands and charity? Charity is something I give out of the goodness of my heart. It can't be forced. Tzedakah is considered the right thing to do. From a Jewish point of view, you know what tzedakah is? That when God gives you blessings, he's giving you more, say 10% more, whatever, than belongs to you, and he wants you to be his agent to give it over to the poor. Do you know that the Rambam says in laws that when there was communities together and everyone lived and they made taxes and all the different things that they raised in the Jewish community to keep the community going, then kaifin, the community had the right to force you to give a percentage to the poor. So tzedakah was not a free choice. It is something that can actually be forced as any other tax in a community. And we had to do it. But the Rambam says that at all times, we should never take a person's dignity away from them. And in fact, you know what is the highest form of tzedakah? As I said, giving a loan, even if you let the loan go, is greater even than just giving a guy charity. And the Rambam says giving a person a job. As the saying goes, give the person a fishing rod rather than a fish, and teach him how to make a living. That is, in fact, the greatest aspect of charity. Now, there's a whole discussion on slavery, but here the Torah goes on to talk about the Jewish slave. A Jewish slave happened in one of two instances. Either a person became so destitute, he was totally homeless, he had no food for himself, and he was forced to sell himself to be able to support his family. Because if he became a slave to someone else, then that someone else had to support the family. The other was, if, God forbid, someone robbed people, then in those days, there were, in the Torah law, there's no jail. What does jail help? Rather, he has to make restitution to the people he stole from. If he didn't have the money to make that restitution, then they would actually sell him for a maximum of 6 years, and that money would go to the people that he robbed. So here the Torah gives us the law called Ha'anokah. Ha'anokah means that once his time was over, you had to give him a type of severance gifts. And it's quite an interesting aspect of all the severance gifts that you had to give people. And then the Torah goes into the law called Bechor, Kol HaBechor, and this we actually read on Yom Tovs. In the times that we were able to go to shul and we had the Torah reading, we would start Kol HaBechor, Asher Yivaled. If that Yom Tov came out on a Shabbos, we would start with Kol HaBechor. And the laws of the firstborn in those days were that the firstborn of a kosher animal that was born, you had to bring as a sacrifice, and certain parts went to the Kohen. If, however, it had a blemish, then you didn't shecht it, but rather you gave it to the Kohen. The Torah goes on to tell us about the festivals that we would have to keep in Israel. And these are called Shalosh Regalim. What does Regalim mean? It comes from the word feet, and in English they call it pilgrimage festivals. That 3 times a year, all Jews of the entire Israel who are able-bodied would have to walk to Jerusalem, to the temple. And there they would have to bring certain sacrifices. And so the Torah goes on to repeat some of the laws of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and the counting of the Omer, which was as I say, the time that we went to the temple. And in that time, we had to bring, the Torah says, a korban re'iyah and a korban chagiga. That is the re'iyah is v'lo yeroas pnei Hashem rekom. That is a certain sacrifice. It says, don't see the Lord empty-handed. So they had to bring animals called a korban re'iyah when you came, that you were seen, you came to see, and you came to be seen. And korban chagiga was, the Torah says, that you have to rejoice at that time. And the rejoicing, the Talmud says, Ein simcha ela b'basar v'yayin. The true joy for a man is a good steak and a good cup of wine. So they had to bring the korban chagiga. As we all know, on our Seder plate, we have 2 items that remind us of 2 sacrifices. You have the shank bone, the zeraya, which reminds us of the Paschal sacrifice. And then we have the egg, which reminds us of the korban chagiga, the festival sacrifice. And in this way, everybody could rejoice. Just by the way, the Talmud says that a man enjoys meat. What should you get for your wife and daughters to create the simcha of Yom Tov? Then you get them clothes. You see, they enjoy clothes more than they enjoy the food. And the Torah goes on to tell us that Sukkot especially was the time of joy. So I'd like to go back a little bit, and with that the portion concludes. I'd like to go back to the aspect of Meiser Sheni, which the Torah mentions here, the second tithe, and the concept that you have. You know, We've often discussed in different shiurim, what system is the Torah? Is it capitalism or socialism? The previous Rebbe on a train, he was in Soviet Russia, and they were discussing which is the best system that the world has. There's capitalism, there's socialism, and there's all kinds of isms. And they asked the Rebbe, which does he think it is? And the Rebbe said that every system that exists in the world, I'm paraphrasing, has some good and some bad because it's man-made. The only system which is true is the Torah system, because the Torah is created by God. So the Torah system has basically more or less the aspect of capitalism, because whatever you earn in your farm, whatever you produce belongs to you, but it also definitely has aspects of socialism in which we have to help the poor. As I said, it's not a voluntary thing, it's a mandatory thing. Then you have the laws of Truma and Maisa, helping out the Kohen and the Levi. Why did we have to help them? We must remember that when the Jewish nation came into Israel, how much did they pay for their farms? They didn't pay. It was granted to each tribe as a gift. But the Kohen and the Levi were not granted those gifts. They were told that they would have to serve in the temple and teach the people the Torah. They were the spiritual agents. And so they would represent the spirituality of the Jews, and the Jews in turn would give them physical for their physical needs. So that's part, in a way, of socialism, and the whole Truma and Maisa and giving of tzedakah. But now comes a concept called Pesach Sheni, which also relates to the three pilgrimage festivals. And to give you a little example, do you know there are many South African families, especially pre-COVID days, that wanted end-of-year holidays, so they would save up, they would put aside monthly to be able to go to holidays. So let's say you went to Mshlange in December. Now there are different ways that families can do it. One way is that you rent your place, you buy all your food, but your kid comes and says, can I have a cold drink? Can I have that? No, you can't have this, you can't have that. You start making a cheshbon on every cent you have. And so the holiday is not really complete because you're still cutting away from them. And at the end of the holiday, you may have a lot of money left over, but that's the way you had it. On the other hand, if I gave a person, let's say, 10,000 rands, I said, this is for your year-end holiday. But I want to tell you something, that if you come back with any money, I'm going to burn it. It's not going to be yours. Then he will truly spend it and enjoy it. And this is what the Pesach Sheni, the Maisa Sheni was all about. It was a second tithe, as I mentioned, in year 1 and 2, in year 4 and 5. And that is that the farmer had to take a second tithe and put it aside. It was for him to spend in Jerusalem. Now, let's say a person's a very wealthy farmer. He comes with all this money. All he could do is spend it for the holidays. But he has too much money to spend it for his family. So what would he do? Let's say he'd hire the penthouse in the Hilton, and he'd ask, Riva's caterer or Gary Friedman's caterer or something like that to just he'd pay them to feed the entire population, anyone who wanted to come. So, because he had nothing else to do with that money, he could only spend it on that food and the basic needs that he had for the temple. So if he had extra, he would invite others to join in them. In that way, there was enough money in Israel in those 4 years that every single Jew who lived in the Holy Land can be sure that he could come with his family for Yom Tov to Jerusalem and have the most wonderful Yom Tov possible. As I say, those 4 years were enough to cover all the 7. In year 3 and 6, instead of taking Meiser Sheni, he would take what is called Meiser Oni, another tithe, and that went to the to the poor. And I'd like to mention another interesting thing. The Torah goes on to tell us not to forget the Levi, because he didn't have an inheritance in the land of Israel. So there's a very interesting discussion as to the priorities of people today. Do we take in account the Cohen and the Levi today as special amongst the poor? And most poskim say that that is not a criteria in giving charity. Why not? Because it was a criteria in Israel, because they worked in the temple and they didn't get a portion in the land of Israel. But today, that no one has a portion per se in the land of Israel, and it doesn't, it has nothing to do with the Kohen and Levi. So there, in that aspect, they don't have the priority. And another thing that the Torah tells us here, hints to anyway, is how we should slaughter our meat. The laws of Shechita, I want to point out, are not truly mentioned specifically. It says you will slaughter the meat in the way I showed you on the mountain. That's all it actually says in the Torah. And it is from the oral law and the laws that God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu while he was on Mount Sinai that described the laws of Shechita. And those are the only ways, as I mentioned during this year, that you may actually eat any type of meat. And those laws are very relevant. And I'd like to read from you when we talk about the aspect of false prophets. I'd like to leave you with 3 foods for thought that they have in the Chaim Miller Chumash, the Chumash that Rabbi Masinta actually printed in South Africa. And that is, why would God empower false prophets to make wonders and miracles? That's question 1. Question 2, has your faith ever been severely tested? The Torah says that the reason God allows these is to test us. Has your faith ever been tested in your life? And finally, the 3rd food for thought is, what would be the modern equivalent of a false prophet? Today, there are many isms and many types of things that are trying to tear us away from Yiddishkeit, from our belief in God. False prophecies, false promises, all these things can fit into that category. And the question that you should ask yourself is, what is the modern equivalent of a false prophet? What in your life is there that tries to take us away from serving God, from believing in Torah and mitzvahs? And with that, I basically will conclude today's share. I see on the Zoom, we have Yitzchak Chana Rivke, Eric Stillerman, Fred Slaughter and Sachs, Ivan Finger, Sarah Jane, Shalom Trigger, Suzanne Lampert, and Yochanan LaGrange. I'm not sure who M's iPhone is, and we had Wayne Miller. So it's lovely to have you join with us. How are you, Yochanan? All the way from Israel. Lovely to see you. And if anyone has any questions, they're welcome to. Otherwise, I say shalom. Till next week, don't forget, as I said, this Shabbos, we are going to bench Rosh Chodesh Elul. We just had yesterday Chaf Av, which is the 20th of the yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father, and that was 40 days to Rosh Hashanah. Shuls, as I mentioned at the beginning, are starting to reopen again. They're talking about it in this country, which is a good sign. So I want to wish everyone, as they go back to shul, as they come back to society, let us hope that the coming year will truly be one of bracha, hatzlacha, of getting more involved. Good shalom and good luck to everyone.